Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Monday, August 15th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 19 days. Getting kind of fun. We can do those basically in our head at this point. Not doing 312 days or whatever. Game is getting pretty close, under 3 weeks to go. The game against Michigan, 103 days. There is some news to let you know about from this weekend before we get into today's show. The Buckeyes named 6 captains over the weekend. Quarterback CJ Stroud, probably unsurprisingly, was the leading vote getter for his teammates, along with wide receiver Cameron Babb, tight end Cade Stover, linebacker Tommy Eichenberg, defensive lineman Tyler Friday, and defensive back Court Williams. Babb was also named the recipient of the Block O jersey this year. And in recruiting, the Buckeyes added a commitment from safety Jaden Bonsu out of New Jersey. We will talk to Alex Gleitman about the impact of that on a show a little later on this week. Fall camp is entering its third week for the Buckeyes. They will be back out on the practice field this morning for practice number 10. They had a scrimmage in Ohio Stadium on Saturday, and we will be back at the Woody Hayes later on today to talk to offensive coordinator Kevin Wilson and the tight ends. Now, that was a position group that seemed like it was one of the big question marks this spring, but it seems like it sort of started to get answered this year as the year has gone along. Maybe it's not quite as much of a concern as it was before, so if that is not a concern, what are the Buckeyes viewing as a question right now? My guest today is Kevin Noon. Never a question. He is with Buckeye Huddle. He is also the host of the Big Meat Kickoff podcast. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Absolutely, anytime.
So an awful lot has gone right for this team this year, and I think they are pretty much universally projected as a Big Ten champion, college football playoff participant, and potentially more than that by just about every source out there. And, I think we've talked about this in the past also. When we talk about concerns for Ohio State, this is not, hey, there's no quarterback on the roster who's thrown a pass this year or, in their career, or, they have to replace all 5 starting offensive linemen. Nothing, the concerns that Ohio State has are not necessarily the same caliber of concerns that a lot of teams have this time of year, but, even other top 10 teams, really. But, I did have 3 things that I wrote down that I think they have to be looking at as at least a little bit of a question mark right now as they're sort of getting towards the halfway mark of fall camp. So let's talk about those things. I have 3 of them down. Number 1, Kevin, is cornerbacks. We've talked about this a few times already this fall, but it feels like this is kind of the biggest question mark on the team because, there are 3 guys who are not quite full go right now, and, there are only 6 guys on scholarship total at that position. So while none of the injuries are supposedly long-term things, it feels like until you see those guys back out there 100%, not on a pitch count, ready to go, I think this has to be like number 1 as with a bullet as far as concerns with this team.
Yeah, I think it's number 1, number 2, and number 3 if we're being honest with ourselves, just because we do see a lot of injuries in football. It's just kind of one of those situations. Notre Dame just lost one of its top receivers for the year with an ACL. I mean, it's just terrible. You want to see everybody come in at full strength. I mean, I know that there's competitiveness, but you got to remember that these aren't video game characters. These are real, young men out there, and you want to see them do well. So you look at Ohio State, and I think that it's kind of you can look at it 2 ways. Yeah, they only have 6, and that's when they're all healthy, and that's not including Jake Seibert. So, so they only have the 6, but on the top end of the list, they're very good. The guys that they have are known quantities, obviously Denzel Burke, Cameron Brown, so you can kind of run with that. I think that Ohio State, even if all 6 were healthy, there would be a little bit of a drop-off as you get to 3 and 4, whether or not that's Ja'Kalen Johnson and Jordan Hancock or wherever you look at it, just because those guys don't have a ton of experience. But when you sit there and you throw in guys who are just kind of banged up and, you got somebody on a pitch count, you got 2 guys that are kind of off to the side, I mean, it is a scary proposition. And, you can sit there and you can look at Notre Dame, and they sit there and they name their starting quarterback Tyler Buckner, who is more of a runner than a passer. I mean, he certainly can throw the ball, but I mean, he's more of a runner. Arkansas State doesn't necessarily have a mobile quarterback as much as maybe Toledo. When you get to there, DeQuan Finn is somebody who can really run the ball. So and throw the ball. So, I think that it is a concern, but, we're not talking about long-term injuries, but what is Ryan Day's definition of a long-term injury? Is it a week? Is it 6 weeks? Is it 12 weeks? So, I mean, it certainly is a concern.
Yeah, and I think that this is a position where this is a little similar. You mentioned the injury to Avery Davis, who's a wide receiver for Notre Dame. it's a little bit similar there where there's not a ton, you've got a couple guys that I think they're feeling good about, but there's not a ton of depth there. Wide receiver was kind of one of the big questions for Notre Dame when we did the Notre Dame preview a month or so ago. To lose someone there, Avery Davis's injury is much more severe than anything we're hearing about any of the corners for Ohio State. But, when you have a position that's a little thin, that's the last spot you want to lose someone from. So, yeah, that is definitely a concern. But to your point, if you're going up against a sort of thin and banged up Notre Dame wide receiver core, if they are a little bit, thin at the cornerback room to start the year, if you can get those guys back, during the, you've got a couple weeks to get those guys back and healthy before you're facing what should be a more explosive passing offense, probably sometime in October. It starts with a pretty a group of fairly meek passing offenses. It looks like. Another spot that I think is a little bit of a concern is linebacker, and this may be more of a depth concern than a overall position concern. The starters, it feels like Tommy Eichenberg and Steel Chambers are pretty well set there, but they're not. Neither of them are really truly proven commodities yet. I think you feel like they're probably on track to be significantly better than they were last year, but you haven't seen them play. Neither of them are 150 tackle linebackers or anything like that. So, and then there was a ton of turnover at this position over the last 12 months, including guys you might not have thought of for a while. I was going through some old photos to get stuff ready for the new website over the weekend, and saw guys in photos like Kayvon Pope and Dallas Gant and Craig Young. And, all those guys are gone. And, you have Taraja Mitchell. He is, in the mix for playing time. You've got Cody Simon. He is in the mix for playing time. But neither of those guys have been, Cody Simon hasn't been healthy consistently. Taraja Mitchell has sort of been on and off the field and sort of lost his job, sort of got Wally pipped a little bit last year at one point. And, it feels like the top two are probably going to be okay, and they might be better than okay. But then behind them, you got some young guys, you got some transfers, you got some position switch guys. It's just, there's nothing is like really sure, certain to me right now at that linebacker position.
Yeah, and at least the good news is that more often than not, they're only going to have two backers out there, which will probably be Steel Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg with Chip Trainum as kind of the third guy. When they go and play in week 4, they play Wisconsin, you're going to have a Sam out there. That's just what it is with Braylon Allen and Ches Malusi. And, those two guys have combined for about 2,100 rushing yards. And you're not necessarily that concerned with Graham Mertz at quarterback there. So, we saw Tommy Eichenberg. I think wasn't he the defensive MVP for the Rose Bowl? He had a ton of tackles. Steel Chambers, pretty much from the second he was inserted out there, looked like the most natural linebacker that they had. So, both those guys have been flashing. You need to turn flashing into consistency, and I think that they're well on their way there. Every report I've heard about Chip Trainum has been very positive. Strongest guy, fastest guy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, we'll kind of see how he mixes in. But, yeah, you do want to sit there. I have always liked Taraja Mitchell. Maybe his path on the field has not necessarily gotten everything done, but he's such a great kid. He's somebody that's really hard not to pull for. Cody Simon, again, somebody that's really hard not to pull for, and injuries have been very difficult for him. We haven't even talked about Reed Carrico, who, is a second-year player, coming out of small school, coming out of Ironton, down on the river. Where is he going to fit in the mix at this point? I haven't heard his name mentioned a lot. So you do need to have some guys that are going to be able to step up, because we may be seeing a game that is turning more and more aerial, but this is a Big Ten, and it's still going to be a ground and pound type of conference. And when you sit there and you play against teams like Wisconsin, you certainly better have more than a pair and a spare.
Yeah, you can say you're a 4-2-5 defense all you want, but if you've got Wisconsin and Iowa on the schedule, you are going to be playing 3 linebackers in at least a couple games, and odds are if they make it to Indianapolis, you will be seeing one of those teams potentially again in Indianapolis. You might have at least 3 of those games on the schedule this year. So yes, you might see more of that Sam backer, and whether that's Palaie Naoteote. We've seen Taraja Mitchell working there a little bit this fall. He's been working inside, he's been working outside at that Sam spot. You mentioned Reed Carrico. He's another guy who's in the mix at Sam. So, yeah, it just feels like they have a lot of pieces, but so much has changed there, both between the scheme, between some of the players, the names there, what they're asking these guys to do. There's just a lot of stuff that until you see it on the field, it feels like this is at least a question mark. I don't know that it's a concern, but it feels like it's at least a question mark to me. One other thing that, this is, I've talked on Buckeye Weekly with Tony Gerderman about rich people problems. This is, offensive line depth is number 3 to me. Now, if you feel pretty good about your top 5 on the offensive line, and it feels like they are pretty comfortable with things there, not necessarily this is going to be the single greatest offensive line in the history of college football, but they feel, they have 5 guys they really can trust who are starting there. The question is kind of behind them. We've seen injuries pull starters off the field. We've seen them have to play depth a bunch of times in the past few years. And I think the question is, how many of those second string guys do they really trust right now? You've got, a couple guys who they've had for a couple of years, guys who've been banged up, who, they like, but haven't had a lot of opportunities to get on the field because of injuries and whatever else. How big of a concern is that offensive line depth to you? Is that, it feels to me like it's a concern, but this is not, our starting quarterback is out and, we have 2 scholarship running backs and neither of them has ever carried the ball in college. Like there are programs with bigger problems than this, but this is something that we have seen come up and bite teams in the past, not having enough depth on the offensive line with guys they can really trust.
Well, I think the question is, how deep do you feel Ohio State is on the line? 7? 7.5? 8? If you're getting down to your 9th offensive lineman, you're probably in trouble. There are not a lot of programs that can weather that type of storm. So, and then the other issue too is, okay, well, somebody's hurt. It's just not a matter of, well, we're going to just go and pick somebody out of the offensive line pool and just drop them in. You've got to get guys fitting in the right positions and everything else. You can't just sit there and say, well, we're going to take this tackle and play him at center. It doesn't work that way. So, sometimes it's a matter of you have more depth if things break the right way, which is kind of a terrible way of putting it. And then sometimes you have less depth if you sit there and you just run out of guards or whatever. And then, then what do you do at that point? So Ohio State, going back, prior to Justin Fry, they still, they've always been very big on cross-training. You're going to, not only are you going to learn the right and the left, but a lot of guys you're going to learn guard and tackle and situations like that. It's kind of an all-hands-on-deck. But, I think Ohio State, it is kind of a rich people's problem or a first-world problem, if you will. I still think at worst, even if you take the most jaded look at things, Ohio State is still about 7 deep on the offensive line. I think they're trying to get they'd like to get to 8, 9. I know everybody would like to sit there and say, well, get to 10. Well, if you get to 10, you buy lottery tickets at that point because most teams generally aren't at that point. And then you couple that, too, with the fact that Ohio State certainly has had some misses on the offensive line in terms of its recruiting. So Ohio State is having to kind of really work that much harder to get guys developed. And when like a name of somebody that seems to really be coming along who apparently has not been a miss is like Zin Mikulski. He was somebody that I was like, that's boom or bust. And right now he seems to be booming at this point, and I'm certainly not going to talk about kids that might be on the other side of that coin, but you need some of those kids to step up, and that's how you get from 7 deep to 8 deep to 10 deep.
Feels like in that depth piece, they feel pretty good about Enoch Vamahi. It feels like they feel pretty good about Josh Fryer, and he's now healthy and back out on the field. And Zen Mikulski feels like he has come a long way. We got a chance to talk to him last week at one point, and he talked about how he'd put on basically 100 pounds since the start of his junior season of high school football. That is, but he has managed to keep it as good weight. He said it was not always good weight back in high school when he first put it on. But now that he's working with Coach Mick, it's good weight again, and they seem pretty comfortable with him. Mikulski and Fryer at tackle, and you've got Vamahi, potentially inside somewhere. It feels like, one of the questions then is, okay, if Luke Whippler goes down at center, who's the backup center? Do they put in Jacob James, who is listed as the backup center, or who's running as the backup center right now? Or do you kick Matt Jones over there and you put Vamahi in at one of the guard positions or something like that? That's the kind of level of questions we're dealing with here. And, we've talked all about how important it is for the offensive line to gel and guys to be used to working together and all that kind of stuff. And it feels like we're at the top 5. They're pretty comfortable there. Once you get into that depth, though, and you start having to mix and match guys, especially if you're moving guys from one position to another, then you're changing multiple spots at once. That's where you're sort of starting to get into the question. So Not, again, these are not necessarily season derailing problems for Ohio State by any means, but sort of things to keep an eye on. I know, this is consider this our pump the brakes episode a little bit. There's been pretty unbridled optimism around Columbus. We love unbridled optimism here. Love to have everyone excited for the season. Just, kind of here's some things just sort of keep an eye on as you go through fall camp. If, you start to hear that these problems are solved, then the optimism can get even a little more unbridled heading into that Notre Dame game in, yes, just 19 days, under 20 days, under 3 weeks. It's almost here. I'm very excited. I'm, yes, like as I mentioned, going through photos and stuff from last year to get ready for the new site at Buckeye Huddle. It should be a really, really fun group of folks there. A lot of familiar names. Tony Gerdeman, Mark Givler, Alex Gleitman, Kevin Noon, Ross Fulton, Justin Whitlatch. Really fun group of guys. Got the recruiting piece covered, got the team piece covered, got the X's and O's scheme piece covered, got a little bit of everything, a little bit of something for everyone at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That site is set to launch very, very soon, so you can check out the free board right now. But then the full site will launch very, very soon. We can't wait as we head into the countdown to the 2022 Ohio State football season. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.